Hello and welcome to another edition of The Antidote, where we're turning the tables on your media landscape. This is Greg McCarron.
And this is Jeremy Rothe Kushel.
Well, Jeremy, as the AIPAC circus of corruption and commences in Washington, D.C., I guess today we're going to be focusing on a circus of another kind, which is the media's narrative of the Russiagate, Russian collusion narrative of Donald Trump colluding with the evil Russian dictator Vladimir Putin to plot to subvert American democracy by being his willing puppet in the White House, which is of course how the media narrative goes. And we're going to be focusing a lot on the alternative media narrative today, which of course says it directly opposes which stands in direct opposition to the mainstream narrative, but also I think perpetuates the conversation about the Russian narrative in a way that I think actually enables the mainstream media narrative to continue to soldier on and to continue to have legs to stand on, when it could very easily, I think, this narrative could very easily be shattered with the real analysis of what appears to really be going on with Donald Trump and his Russian quote unquote connections that he's had basically throughout his entire adult life, throughout his entire career as a casino mogul, hotel mogul, however you want to describe him, of course, and a lot of the activities that went on during his time in the casino business. So anyway, we're going to be getting into a conversation on that, and particularly I think how the elements of the left media have been covering this, kind of following up on our program last week where we discussed the coverage of Maggie Haberman of the New York Times at the end of our most previous program. But before we get there, we'd like to mention the recent video that Brendan O'Connell just put up on YouTube titled "Israeli Drones Worldwide." I just wanted to give a shout to Brendan, as he has put together another very excellent high quality video. And I think Brendan is someone who is definitely making the most of the resources he has and putting out very important information about elements of the Talpiot program, of activities that are taking place between Russia and Israel that I think have a very significant, very important consequences globally. And Brendan does it in a very unorthodox but very effective manner, and so I just wanted to mention this latest video, and I think he's done an excellent job on it.
Yes, I agree too, and especially during the time of the year, the sort of lone time of the year of the AIPAC conference, when there is finally some focus on the Israeli lobby. I think it's even more important that people understand that the kind of work that Brendan O'Connell is doing is being done basically by almost no one else in the entire world, and that he's really put himself on the line to put this information out there in a serious, but also lighthearted and in as joyful manner as possible to deal with the depth and the danger that's presented by the domination of the world's databases by the heart of the Israeli security state. And as a Jewish American patriot of conscience, which is the way that I would describe my political affiliation, and that also encapsulates some of my national background as an American, but also some of my ethno-religious background as a Jew, I think that this is very, very important information for Jews of conscience worldwide to look at, but also American dissidents and people who are suspicious of Israeli influence in the United States of America, and that the domination of the databases, the domination of the high technology sector worldwide has been the expansion of the Samson option that was grown out of the Israeli nuclear program. And this one has very, very far reach to it in relationship to the high technology sector as it spreads out around the world, and the rise of the potential of AI. And in the recent week, as we've seen the rise of the throwing people, deplatforming people, kicking people off of platforms such as YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, something like Google, which represents the singular, most credible, public, identifiable source of the potential of the rise of artificial intelligence, that we understand that this is really what we are facing as humanity. If we can get past the threats of the actual inflaming of potential World War IV scenarios or World War V scenarios, if depending on what kind of neocon you get your intelligence from, we then are going to have to face the problem of the rise of artificial intelligence, the threat of a Skynet. So the facts that are presented by Brendan O'Connell in relationship to the long-term strategy presented most in a most core fashion by the Talpiot program as a way to send operatives out into the world to dominate the high technology sector in a highly militarized and aggressive fashion is really crucial to understand right now. So I just want to give thanks to Brendan for continuing his work on that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I think Brendan's just very unorthodox manner. I think it's a welcome and refreshing change sometimes because a lot of time you get a lot of very sober-minded just analysis, very serious analysis. Of course, that's fine, but I think sometimes a change of pace you'll get from the type of videos and information Brendan puts out, I think, is very welcome. So yes, definitely check that out, Israeli Drones Worldwide by Brendan O'Connell. And so now I guess we're going to get into following up on what we talked about last week with Russiagate not being anything but a nothing burger, but not for the reasons that people within the within the mainstream media and the U.S. government will tell you. It's not for those reasons. I mean, I think that for us, I think that we're coming now to the realization, I think, when you start to see all these connections to this kind of this global, I guess you might call it a Zionist, Orthodox Jewish Chabad connected kind of mafia that is centered around Donald Trump his entire life and has also played a very prominent role in Vladimir Putin's Russia, that we're seeing a narrative here that not only goes beyond Russia, but I think it also goes beyond Israel, and it extends way beyond just Russia, just Israel, just Putin, just Benjamin Netanyahu, and I think it extends globally into perhaps an element of power that goes just way beyond these entities and these individuals and these individual players. And I think with the alternative media, I think there's a very similar argument being made both within the alternative media, the left media, and the right media. And I think this becomes very consequential when you look at the coverage of how, say, Maggie Haberman of the New York Times has covered the Russiagate narrative, and how it really shows the majority of the mainstream media has treated this Trump-Russia collusion with kid gloves and made it all about Putin and made it all about just the generic Cold War conversation of Russia and America engaged in this is just a continuation of the Cold War or whatever, and Russia's never changed its stripes and all that, and Putin represents the old boogeyman that's trying to destroy American democracy and all that. And the way the alternative media, I think majority of alternative media outlets, whether you're on the left or the right, has framed this narrative has been in a way that I think has actually enabled the perpetuation of this mainstream narrative. Instead of getting into what I believe is very documented and very provable open information that is out there about the real collusion, if there's any type of collusion, or real relationships between Donald Trump and these high-level, quote-unquote, Russian criminal mafia figures, which I think is the real extent of, quote-unquote, Russiagate. And as I said, it has consequences far beyond just Russia and Israel and the United States, I think, on a global level. I think this narrative is perpetuated because the alternative media continues to just, for the most part, with few exceptions, continues to just promote this as a narrative, make it centered around Vladimir Putin and centered around just Russia in general, rather than this bigger picture, which I think is really elaborated upon and proven when you look at the very open and provable resources that are out there proving this connection, such as in the Russiagate dossier compiled by Fitzpatrick Informer, fitzinfo.wordpress.com, that we linked to in our show last week. And so I think that this has been very perpetuated within this alternative media complex. And I want to focus on elements of how the left media has been covering this story. And I wanted to start with you found an article by the Australian blogger Caitlin Johnstone, which I think is a pretty good indicator of where we're going with this, of how the way that these left media people and activists and bloggers are just completely just misrepresenting and simplifying the Russiagate narrative, just making it about Putin and democracy and all this and that, and these regular media talking points, and kind of a lot of cases pointing to the Clintons and the complicity of the Clinton network, like John Podesta, as being reasons why we should never look into Russiagate, why it's just a nothing burger, and why it's designed to just perpetuate and foment conflict. And so I find it interesting, real quick, with Caitlin Johnstone. I've made this evaluation because we've kind of followed the infighting between Caitlin Johnstone and various people on the left who have kind of taken issue with her willingness to work with people like Mike Cernovich and Jack Posobiec. And it's very interesting when you look at Caitlin Johnstone's coverage of Russiagate, and you compare that with not just her critics on the left, but you also compare it with people like Mike Cernovich, the people who Caitlin Johnstone has been vilified for kind of having a willingness to work together with. Their narrative on this whole Russia collusion theory is basically the same all around this entire alternative media network on the right and the left. The narrative is virtually the same, and I find that very interesting. I also find that very revealing. But Jeremy, do you want to read from this blog post that Caitlin Johnstone put out about the Russia narrative?
Yes, and just to preface that, in also expanding upon that point that you just made about this interesting commonality between the alt-right types of the Mike Cernovich's approach to Russiagate as a full-on tamping down, with Caitlin Johnstone coming much more from an alt-left or left perspective, which is a different reasoning behind the tamping down of the Russiagate story. That also, what's interesting is that those on the left who have criticized Caitlin for opening up the possibility of political collaboration in areas such as non-interventionism or anti-war type of areas with the parts of the right, such as people who have criticized her for that, such as the sort of orbit surrounding Max Blumenthal and Robbie and Abby Martin, that type of thing. It's interesting that they have a very similar approach also to this Russiagate story too. So there is an interesting tie there in terms of all the folks who are having a tough time dealing with the facts as they lay in relationship to what's been titled Russiagate. And I also want to say that I understand it in many ways too, because whether it's folks who are really anti-war, and in many ways I think chosen to read Caitlin Johnstone's article about this, because in many ways she articulates the best reasoning from the left that I've seen about why not to deal with this, because she says that it doesn't matter in a certain way, because the way that it's being used is to reinvigorate some type of Cold War aggressive hostile position, which is a compelling reasoning. I don't know if it's a compelling reason enough to dismiss the facts, and especially if we were to find that some of those facts might actually get us further to the root of the ongoing war of terror. And so those are the other folks who are having a hard time, I think, dealing with this Russiagate story, are folks even in the 9/11 truth sphere who, in the post 9/11 world, saw Putin's Russia as a bit of, if not a moderating influence, at least some type of pushback in the region of the Middle East, for example, where you saw the United States and the rest of what we could call a Zionist-goaded West going into predominantly Muslim and Arab countries and destabilizing them and killing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people in the process. And people saw Putin and Russia as at least some type of counterbalance. And at the same time, it's very clear, and it's been pretty obvious to me over the years too, that there's a problem here at the very sort of basic level. As someone who's very tuned into the 9/11 truth as a core issue, not only in terms of understanding the world, I've described it as a potential philosopher's stone, and that you can take a singular historical object and then use that to understand a lot of the power networks that dominate our world in a negative fashion, but also as the Achilles heel of that imperial set too, and that the entirety of the 21st century long war narrative that includes not only military forces on the ground in the Middle East or in Africa increasingly, but also drones increasingly all around the world. And it's also casting back to Brendan O'Connell's recent video about Israeli drones worldwide, this idea of playing on the wording of drone as not only a UAV, but also as someone who is a drone for a certain mind state, or is a shill of some sort, or an agent on behalf of. And so thinking back through this idea that this Achilles heel of this ongoing war that is not only represented by that physical drone worldwide that Bush really started, Obama increased, and Trump is escalating even, but then also the domestic police state, the increasing surveillance, the AIification of our potential, the closing down of our discourse, the Israelification of our police. This is also represented as part of the post 9/11 long war. So in thinking through all of that, it was clear that Putin was not, he never bucked the 9/11 lie. And if he were really a serious foe to the post 9/11 era, Russia would have been in the UN exposing the voluminous open source evidence of 9/11 lies.
Or at the very least, Putin would have been making more noise about the illegal actions in, say, Libya, for example, and even Putin even kind of failed to do that. So you can even go beyond just September 11th. But very clearly, you're correct in what you're saying here. Putin has failed ways to, I think, the criminality of the post-September 11th world and tying it to the actual crime, which made it all possible.
And I think dealing with 9/11 as a core issue here is appropriate also in terms of the subject that we're dealing this week with, in terms of the left's approach to Russiagate. Is very appropriate because a lot of this, whether it's this James Risen debate with Glenn Greenwald hosted by the Intercept and Jeremy Scahill, where there's a very strong emphasis on the word treason and how appropriate is the word treason for the allegations about Trump's and his campaign's potential relations with alleged Russian meddling in the elections and these types of things. Whereas you could see the 9/11 lies as the heart of global treason. And it's very, very clear, if there's a singular event or a series of events in U.S. history, 9/11 is the prototype of treason. That means then that under Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution, that the ongoing cover-up of it is giving aid and comfort, definitionally treason, to the enemies who attacked us on September 11th. But in this global context, and of Putin being the sort of the dog who didn't bark in a certain way, as the global treason project was initiated post 9/11, we can point to multiple other world leaders from a whole wide variety of different countries who did speak up at certain points, whether it was the Yukihisa Fujita in the Japanese Diet, whether it was Mahathir Mohamad from Malaysia, whether it was aspects of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, whether it was even Ahmadinejad in Iran at one point. So, but yes, the list is not that extensive, and so it shows that this ongoing cover-up is worldwide, And it also might even imply that what is the relationship of the kill switch diplomacy that Brendan O'Connell insists is part and parcel of the Talpiot program's domination of the world's databases, to the world's leaders not blowing the whistle on this. And of course, one last thing in relationship to this issue of aspects of the left and aspects of the alt-light or alt-right not understanding this Russia connection is that it's clear that Putin took advantage of this. In a certain way, he had already begun to wage war on Chechnya before September 11th. And then there was the cases of the Moscow apartment bombings there's clearly an aspect of that was it was basically a caught false flag of some sort. It's not yet been directly connected to the highest levels of the Russian government. There could have been other elements involved, but it's very suggestive in combination with what Putin and the highest levels of the Russian government saw as their Muslim problem to the southwest. And so that, I think, is key to understand here in terms of what is an organizing factor that would put the center of political power not in D.C. or in London or in the European Union or in Moscow, but in Tel Aviv. And what that would be the global war on terror and the stagecraft of blaming global terrorism on Muslim groups in a way that multiple power sets, as even someone like Noam Chomsky after September 11th identified them, multiple power sets would benefit from the 9/11 action. He was definitely correct in that, even if he was also another dog that didn't bark. That there were many power sets that were going to take advantage of this overarching narrative that hooks directly in to the security state of Israel. So that being said, I think those are some of the things that need to be considered in relationship to where elements of the left media will not go in relationship to this Russiagate story. Because I believe that it might be somewhat connected potentially. So I'm going to just read through this article that Caitlin Johnstone wrote on her website, Caitlin Johnstone, Rogue Journalist. I mentioned this last week. Russia conspiracy theorists have failed to meet their burden of proof. And I'm just going to read through it, and then we'll do a little bit of analysis and some side fact-checking. The establishment Russia narrative is soul-wittingly dull. Oh, hey, a shocking bombshell revelation about something Russia did. Everyone freaks out, then people actually look into the nature of the allegation, and it turns out it's nothing. Lather, rinse, repeat. An interminable addition of zeros, day after day after day after day. Boring. One of the very few interesting specks of light on the scene has been Aaron Mate and his unusual knack for convincing promulgators of the establishment Russian narrative to debate him, shining a big spotlight on just how weak the argument is. In December, he famously debated collusion author Luke Harding in a beatdown that was the verbal equivalent of watching a prime Mike Tyson fight Bruno Mars. And he recently had a more low-key but equally revealing interview with John Pfeffer of Low Blog and Foreign Policy in Focus. Like Harding, Pfeffer based his debate on the assumption of a, quote, pattern, unquote, of allegations about the Russian government and its supposed support for the 2016 Trump campaign, which taken individually are all poorly substantiated and easily debunked, but taken together create the illusion of a solid argument in a debate tactic known as a Gish-Gallop fallacy. Named for a young Earth creationist who made abundant use of the tactic, a Gish-Gallop is designed to overwhelm the opposing side with a deluge of weak points that are difficult to dispute in their entirety in a real-time dialogue. The mainstream Russian narrative is made entirely of such individually weak arguments. Russiagate is one giant gish gallop. Mate employed the same strategy as he did with Harding, stopping and pointing out the individually weak points in Pfeffer's arguments, like the absence of evidence for the DNC hack and the unsubstantiated claims by the Dutch intelligence community, which forced Pfeffer to change tactics in a very interesting way I'd like to highlight here. Go to this transcript of the interview and do a search for the word, quote, counter, unquote. It starts popping up after a few exchanges, always in the same way and always from Pfeffer. I'll list their occurrences here. Quote, I have to say that the evidence is far more compelling than the counter argument, which is we don't know, or it could be a fat guy sitting on a couch somewhere, unquote. Quote, well, you keep bringing up all these sources that you don't really have much faith in, but frankly, what is the counter narrative? Who exactly hacked into the DNC, unquote? It's been, quote, it's been challenged, but I find the narrative that's been put forward to be honestly more convincing than the counter narrative, unquote. Quote, so yes, there is evidence. If you think that the evidence is robust or not is up to you. I personally think it's far more robust than any of the counter narratives that have been put forward, which have absolutely no bearing in reality, unquote. Do you see what Pfeffer is doing here? And this is Johnstone again. He is trying to shift the burden of proof off of the party that is making the claim. The whole debate could be accurately summed up as Mate sitting there pointing out the unsubstantiated nature of each of Pfeffer's claims, and Pfeffer trying to turn it around by saying there's no proof of Mate's, quote, counter-narrative, unquote, either. This is plainly fallacious. The power establishment which lied about Iraq, lied about Libya, lied about Vietnam, and is currently lying about Syria is not entitled to the benefit of the doubt that it is telling the truth about Russia and its new Cold War escalations with that country. It most certainly carries the burden of proof, and it has most certainly failed to meet that burden. And I want to return to this article in just 1 second to sort of point out her better points in relationship to this. But then I also want to point out that it's interesting that she, although she links back to the original videos and transcripts in this, as far as I can see, she never identifies the actual site, the platform that Aaron Mate did both of these interviews from, which is the Real News Network. And I just want to, on a side real quickly, I just want to point out that there is some serious issues. And Greg, you've alerted to me that there's a major shift actually happening to the Real News Network. Do you want to fill folks in about that before I say what I found?
Yeah, real quick. Max Blumenthal, of course, we've talked about Max Blumenthal in the past, the son of Sidney Blumenthal, and his, of course, Sidney Blumenthal's connections with the criminality of the Clinton family, and how Max is in previous days and previous years has actually, it seems, helped his father cover up and helped his father actually push the narrative that the Clinton State Department was pushing with regards to Libya, and then also with the Benghazi attacks later on. I think we've documented elements of that in some of our past shows. And but anyway, Max Blumenthal has a blog, a project, the Gray Zone Project, which is dedicated to countering and exposing Islamophobia. That was previously carried on the Alternet website, and now it is completely moved over to the Real News Network. So now Max Blumenthal, as well as his good pal Benjamin Norton, who's another player who kind of did a 180 on Syria, going from being a big time supporter of the rebels, the quote unquote rebels that were trying to remove Assad from power, to being an opponent of the attempts to destabilize Syria. They both are now officially in an official working capacity with the Real News, and I think this is worth keeping an eye on when you think about Max Blumenthal's recent criticism of, say, Democracy Now! And it almost appears to me that perhaps the Real News is being becoming almost sort of a platform for people on the left who are kind of disenchanted with like the coverage that, say, Democracy Now! Or the Young Turks are giving, and disenchanted with their overall perspective on things. So I think it will be worth keep taking a look at the Real News Network here as time goes on here and see their coverage of these issues and how it influences the left narrative. But I would say yes, the Real News has been very much at the forefront of this confusion and this I believe, mislabeling and misinterpreting of the Russia narrative that has gone on. And Jeremy, you have some facts to share about some of the roots of the Real News real quick, I believe.
Yes, and the Real News came on the scene in about 2007, 8 in there, and increasingly it's become seen on the left as like the real democracy now in some way, or something like that, where there are a much wider ranging conversations about some of the issues that democracy now might not cover. And I remember when Real News came on the scene that one of its big early topics was 9/11. Allegedly 9/11 truth, and it was interesting that some of their earliest videos, Paul Jay, the main founder of Real News, who's still at the helm, was very much going the route of what ended up being the sort of the 28 pages road down the road in terms of the Saudi involvement and the cover up of the Saudi role of in September 11th. But what's also interesting is that Real News has also been the site, the platform where someone like Max Blumenthal has led the way in an attack on activists and intellectuals like Gilad Atzmon, and in the work to try to drive him out of Palestinian solidarity circles and to try to not get the left to talk to him. And it was on Real News Network that Max Blumenthal, in conversation with Paul Jay, attacked Gilad Atzmon as an anti-Semite, I believe. August of 2013, Israel, Anti-Semitism and Negotiations Without End. Max Blumenthal and Reality Asserts Itself. And we'll post all these links here, including Gilad Atzmon's response, Everything But Real News. And then there's also Christopher Bolin is basically one of the few other people who's really dug in a little bit to what the Real News potentially represents in terms of a platform. And we'll link this article to the Real Kosher News Network and the 9/11 cover-up, where he points out down the way the founders of the Real News Network, Rabbi David M. Ostreicher, left, and Paul J. Right, have worked together for many years on films and the Canadian television network, the CBC. Ostreicher and Jay are also the founders of the Hot Docs Film Festival. And so this is there's a whole wider range of facts here about Christopher Bolin's allegations about what they are not covering, whether this might be some form of Israeli-based propaganda, potentially even, these kinds of questions that Bolin is raising that are interesting and should be considered. But when you go into the business plan, the original business plan, I believe, of the Real News, you see that yes, David Ostreicher was originally on the board of directors. I don't believe he's there anymore. And I just noticed, and we'll link to this too, people should look through this document, but I just realized now that under Technology Advisory Committee is one Mark Lukovsky, the technical director of engineering at Google Inc. And this is the origins of the Real News Network. Okay, and what I just found out that I just want to put on the table, we won't go too deep into it, but I just want to put it on the table for researchers out there to look into and figure out what it might mean, is we reported last year about this Unit 9900 in the IDF. It's basically an intelligence unit to give autistic kids who otherwise wouldn't be able to make it into the Israeli army to have a role in doing some type of geospatial analysis, I believe. And I found another article that I hadn't seen before in the jewishnews.timesofisrael.com, Autism and the IDF, How a Unique Unit is Ending Exclusion. People with developmental disabilities can often be excluded from serving in the Israel army, but a special unit is changing that, by Jenny Fraser. And so it talks about this unit 9900, Roim Rashok. We've mentioned it before. And then in so doing, I was looking into what is the background and what is the story of Rabbi David Ostreicher, a clear, important figure in the origins of the Real News Network, and an earlier close working partner of the still leader of the helm, Paul Jay. And I found a website called fullspectrummediacoaching.com. And on the homepage, it says, "Embracing the minds of 9900, Unit 9900, Our Story." Full Spectrum Media Coaching is a nonprofit organization that trains job coaches. FSMC gives the coaches the tools and skills to teach commercial video editing to young adults with autism spectrum disorder. So then you're like, well, what does this have to do with the Real News Network? So then you go to our team. You click on our team for Full Spectrum Media Coaching, where Unit 9900 is front and center. And our team, founder, executive director, Rabbi Ostreicher, started his preparation for the rabbinate as a producer and director of photography. Throughout the Cold War, Rabbi Ostreicher was in Afghanistan, as well as spending time with Jonas Savimbi in the jungles of Angola. He tracked Soviet and Cuban operatives in Europe.
Real quick, what I find really interesting about this is that Rabbi Ostreicher, the co-founder of the Real News, working with, and seems, Jonas Savimbi, and keeping track of Soviet and Cubans agents, I guess, who were acting to actually help the Angolan resistance to Jonas Savimbi and the American-backed regime in Angola, is that this flies directly in the face of the Real News's public stance as being a defender and as being of the what is called the global South, the anti-imperialist movement globally. So I found that interesting.
Yes, so it says he tracks Soviet and Cuban operatives in Europe, the Mideast, and North America. I'll finish reading this, but does this sound like the background of your average rabbi slash TV producer, or does this sound like the background of some type of intelligence operative who definitely probably should?
I'll take the ladder for 600, Alex.
So I'll keep moving on here beyond when he spent the Cold War in Afghanistan and tracked Soviet and Cuban operatives in Europe, the Mideast, and North America. Rabbi Ostreicher received his rabbinic ordination from Rav Dovid Shochet, the president of the Orthodox Council of Ontario in 2010. Also the founder of KosherTube, Rabbi Ostreicher has served as the senior consultant to CTS shows Messages and Passages. He has served on the executive committee of the Academy of Canadian Cinema and Television and is a past chair of the Canadian Independent Film Cactus, as well as a founder of the Hot Docs Film Festival. By the way, remember that's with Paul Jay. Rabbi Ostreicher is a member of the Directors Guild of Canada and a lifetime member of the Canadian Society of Cinematographers. He was a founding board member of Toronto Talmud Torah, as well as serving on the board of directors of William Lyon Mackenzie Co-op. His films and programs have been screened in more than 60 countries, garnering more than 40 international and Canadian awards, including 2 Geminis. Through KosherTube and now Full Spectrum Media Coaching, Rabbi Ostreicher takes advantage of his 5 decades of media experience to make this world a better place. Full Spectrum Media Coaching, is that related to full spectrum dominance? I don't know. I also have a concept of full spectrum populism that I think we should embrace. But then before moving on here, back to the Johnstone article, in thinking through this sort of key player in the founding of the platform of Real News Network, which is key to the apparent debunking or poo-pooing of the Russiagate narrative, but also, as you described, an increasingly focal spot for some of the key players on the left. So it says the administrative assistant, Moshe Ostreicher, a young adult, is able to identify with the age demographic our program targets. He completed high school with honors, graduating as an Ontario scholar, and went on to complete a gap year of learning in Israel. Moshe has several years of experience as a youth correspondent for KosherTube. Last year, while in Israel, he developed and launched a successful food business at his yeshiva. Okay, there's more of that, and I want to leave this aside for now. Oh, except for I want to point out that it's very clear that Unit 9900 was a key piece of their reasoning for starting this company. I just want to, I'll just read this quickly. Okay, I'm going to get down to, okay, this is in their inspiration, our inspiration, close to the heart. The issue of lack of adequate programming and funding for adults with autism spectrum disorder is what inspired the founder, Rabbi David Ostreicher, to create Full Spectrum Media Coaching. The ultimate goal of this program is to help prepare both young and mature adults on the spectrum to move beyond the walls of the school into society, gaining self-esteem, a career purpose, and a greater degree of independence. Inspired by the initiative Intelligence Unit 9900 in Beersheba, Israel, Full Spectrum Media Coaching is a win-win for everybody involved, except for Palestinians and then the rest of the world, I guess, that doesn't want to be dominated by the Talpiot program. Unit 9900, the inspiration for Full Spectrum Media Coaching, is the IDF, Israel Defense Forces, Unit 9900. Special Intelligence Unit 9900 is dedicated to everything related to topographic image analysis, including mapping, interpretation of aerial and satellite photographs, and space research. Within this unit, there is a small unit of highly qualified soldiers who have remarkable visual and analytic capabilities. They can detect even the smallest details undetectable to most people. The uniqueness of this elite group in Unit 9900 lies in the fact that they are all diagnosed on the autism spectrum. Mm-hmm. Full Spectrum Media Coaching is the civilian application of Unit 9900 training program. Close to home in Ontario, Canada, we are also facing the global trends with an increased number of students with autism to have aged out of the school system. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. But to me, this is stunning.
Yeah. I will sum this up by saying that at the very least, I think that Paul J should at the very least should be questioned about this. And I think that it'd be very interesting, very revealing to get his answers to some of these questions. Everything from the Jonas Savimbi connection to all of this involved direct connections. It appears back to Israel and the Israel Defense Forces. But it will be very interesting to follow how the Real News Network helps to shape the narratives here in the near future here. So
yeah, and clearly people like Max Blumenthal and Benjamin Norton, who purport to be authentic leftists, I think should account for some of the origins of their new platform. So back to the Caitlin Johnstone article, where she's referencing these key interviews on Real News Network without actually telling us this is the Real News Network, although linking to them. This is plainly fallacious. The power establishment, which lied about Iraq, lied about Libya, lied about Vietnam, and is currently lying about Syria, is not entitled to the benefit of the doubt that it is telling the truth about Russia and its new Cold War escalations with that country. It most certainly carries the burden of proof, and it has most certainly failed to meet that burden. I think I read that before. Then she posts a Naomi Wolf exposes fake news, false flags video that people should go look at. I remember when that happened. From the false Nayira testimony, that's the one, I believe that's the the first Iraq war, right? Testimony by an ambassador's daughter talking about Iraq
the
soldiers.
Kuwaiti emir. I believe it was the daughter of the emir of Kuwait at the time, and Kuwait was the government. It was Kuwait that Iraq invaded as the justification for the first Persian Gulf War.
Yes, to the Gulf of Tonkin incident, to Saddam has WMD, to quote Gaddafi's troops are taking Viagra for rape, unquote. By the way, wasn't that one of the things that Max's dad said? Yes.
Blumenthal, yes.
To the Banya al-Abed Psyop, that's the Syrian girl, there is an abundance of publicly available evidence that the U.S. power establishment will unhesitatingly lie to the public to manufacture consent for war, and the mainstream media will unhesitatingly help them. You do not need to dip into tinfoil hat territory to see this. This is publicly available information. So it's interesting also, she gives a list of these mass psyops, in some cases even almost like on the edge of a false flag, but will not actually deal with actual false flags or the lie that the entire world leadership basically to a large extent accepts 9/11. The U.S. centralized empire, she writes, has every incentive to lie in order to manufacture support for escalations which hobble the Russia-China tandem, and has an extensive history of doing so. It isn't up to us to come up with a perfect, quote, counter-narrative, unquote, for how that happened behind the opaque wall of deep state secrecy. That's an argument from ignorance. It isn't up to us to prove a negative. It is up to them to prove their positive claim. Prove the DNC hack. Prove that the troll farm had ties to the Russian government and an intention of disrupting the election. Provide proof of any Trump-Russia collusion whatsoever. That has not happened at all. There is currently no convincing reason to believe that this isn't another, quote, Saddam has WMD, unquote. And there is every reason not to. Iraq was an absolutely unforgivable crime against humanity, and it is everyone's duty to prevent the U.S. centralized empire from ever being given that trust again. World-threatening escalations keep mounting between two nuclear superpowers, and this evidence-free narrative is being used to justify it. In a post-Iraq invasion world, this is simply unacceptable. The burden of proof is on the people promoting Russia conspiracy theories, and they have failed to meet this burden. Until the mountain of proof needed in a post-Iraq invasion world is provided, that's all that really needs to be said. That's how she finishes it up.
Well, I think that Caitlin speaks a lot of truth in that article, particularly about the duplicity and the deception of the of this government, clearly. And she makes a valid case for why the government narrative on this whole Russia collusion should not be trusted. But the problem with that is that we and other astute observers have identified is that there is a narrative that goes way beyond what the media and government are trying to promote and perpetuate. And it seems to me that someone like a Caitlin Johnstone, I get the impression that she's completely closed her mind to the realities of these actual important, well-documented facts that are out there. So while she puts out a lot of important facts and truths about what this government is doing and why it shouldn't be trusted, I also think that perhaps she's closed her mind to a lot of the more, I think, valid, damning evidence that's out there that points to something that's much more sinister and much more, I think, consequential than just simple Russian collusion to try to hurt American democracy with their willing puppet Trump.
Yes. And also it should be once again pointed out that the commonality here in terms of large portions of people from very different political perspectives here in relationship to tamping down, poo-pooing, ignoring, rejecting, ridiculing this whole area of what's really an open source investigation to the background of Trump and the people who put him in office. That includes New York City, that includes aspects of D.C., that includes parts of the Council for National Policy Networks that spread throughout the country, that includes the city of London, that includes Turkey, Kazakhstan, Moscow, Tel Aviv. This is an ongoing open source investigation that is way beyond, hasn't been proven in some way. Sure, if one wants to limit it to Mueller and or what the Democrat, the DNC, or MSNBC are saying, even then, there's still, if you were interested and curious in getting to the root of what it might actually mean. For example, a lot of poo-pooing has been made about these latest 13 indictments of Mueller, and did these 13 people in some office in Moscow change the entire course of the election? That's one question. Sure, you could poo-poo that. But you also could look into the fact that some of these indictments that Mueller has been making are now starting to get closer and closer to what was being alleged about this tie to Alpha Bank, And so folks here on the left or in the alt-right or the alt-light who are trying to tamp this down should actually just research some very mainstream news articles that will give them some information about what's actually going down here. For example, GQ. Here's an article from February 20th, 2008 by Ben Schreckinger at GQ. A Moscow, how Mueller's latest indictment relates to the Steele dossier. And by the way, just this morning, the New Yorker has published a Jane Mayer article about the background of Christopher Steele, which is very, very interesting that people should go and read. And one thing that she drops is that when Steele was young and a student, I believe, at Cambridge, he was the first ever student that invited someone from the PLO to do a debate at his college.
Head of I believe, the Cambridge Student Union, which I guess would be the equivalent of the Oxford Union. And it's amazing. It's interesting to me that you've got, and perhaps this information is just unknown until now, or isn't on the public record, but it's interesting to me how, people like Bill Kristol and Paul Singer are so willing to promote this dossier when I think in most cases they would probably dismiss someone like Christopher Steele as being an enabler of terrorism and anti-Semitism. So.
Yes, and the commonality, I think that I failed to finish my point about the commonality of the people who are poo-pooing this is that they will not deal with the actuality, the historicity of deep politics, such as false flag operations, such as September 11th, most markedly. And that is a very striking commonality from increasingly even the InfoWars set to clearly the Jerome Corsys to the even the Breitbart people, but even into the alt-light Cernoviches, but all the way back to the left and the Intercept and James Risen and Greenwald and Scahill and then Abby and Robbie Martin and Max Blumenthal and Caitlin Johnstone. What'd you say?
You can throw in the Daily Stormer, Richard Spencer, David Duke alt-right in there as well.
Yes, so that is stunning here. So, but meanwhile, in the midst of GQ, how Mueller's latest indictment relates to the Steele dossier. A Moscow bank keeps popping up in the Trump-Russia affair. Ben Schreckinger reports with the latest. On Tuesday, Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller made another surprise indictment, this time of a London-based lawyer for allegedly lying to the FBI. Like two of Mueller's previous targets, Paul Manafort and his deputy Rick Gates. By the way, Paul Manafort tied directly into Oleg Deripaska, who's a key Russian oligarch who people need to research. And his deputy Rick Gates, the lawyer, a man named Alex van der Zwaan, had done work for Ukraine's previous pro-Russia government, which was overthrown in a popular uprising in 2014. Okay, so you're reading through mainstream media, corporate media, so there's also things that we need to be able to read through that. It wasn't necessarily just a popular uprising. It was also a Gladio operation with paid snipers shooting at both sides and funding by Western intelligence services and very close involvement of Israeli intelligence services. But meanwhile, that just because there's disinformation in here or incorrect facts, does that mean that the rest of this is for sure incorrect? Wouldn't say that about Caitlin Johnstone, who makes key, important ethical points from her political perspective in relationship to skepticism towards the American empire's allegations at this late date in history. And I completely agree with that. But just because she leaves out 9/11, does that mean that everything else, or she misses some interpretation? Does that mean that we don't read through people's stuff? No. So back to the article. And according to the indictment, the false statements in question were about communications he had in 2016 with Rick Gates and an unnamed person A related to that work. So on its surface, Tuesday's indictment relates solely to a single branch of Mueller's investigation. Paul Manafort's dealing with the pro-Russia faction in Ukraine. But search beyond the scant details offered in the two-page indictment, and there's an intriguing link to a whole other branch of Trump-Russia inquiry, the Alpha Bank mystery. As it so happens, van der Zwaan, the lawyer indicted Tuesday, is the son-in-law of Russian oligarch German Khan. Khan is a director and co-owner of Alpha Bank and one of the three key leaders of its parent company, the sprawling conglomerate Alpha Group. Those of you following along at home will remember Russia's Alfa Bank popped up prominently in the Steele dossier and figured in news reports that the FBI was investigating unexplained connections between the Trump organization and computer servers owned by the bank. The exact nature of the relationship, if there is one, between Alfa Bank and Trump world has been unclear. But with von der Zwaan, who pleaded guilty on Tuesday, Mueller may have quietly given us a new connection worth noting. Okay, so that's important to note there. And putting that article aside, but this is all on the surface. So this is all investigatable, and this could be looked into by all these people poo-pooing this entire story. And of course, this actually, if you think about the dubious Friends of Donald Trump done by Dutch TV, I believe, in relationship to certain American journalists, this is what they also found, is that this goes to the heart of an international sort of mob-based conspiracy that involves money laundering and probably much, much worse if you sort of look into Trump's background and Roy Cohn and all this type of thing. So then one last mention, and then I'll throw it over to you, is there's also like the dallasnews.com, and this is an article that I haven't seen covered much and looked into much by almost anyone else. How Putin's proxies help funnel millions into GOP campaigns, by Ruth May at the dallasnews.com. And this is from last December 2017. As special counsel Robert Mueller's team probes deeper into potential collusion between Trump officials and representatives of the Russian government, investigators are taking a closer look at political contributions made by U.S. citizens with close ties to Russia. I'm going to skip down. An example is Len Blavatnik, a dual U.S.-UK citizen and one of the largest donors to the GOP Political Action Committee in the 2015-2016 election cycle. Blavatnik's family emigrated to the U.S. in the late 70s from the USSR, and he returned to Russia when the Soviet Union began to collapse in the late 80s. And I'm not going to read any more of this, but it really does go into this, what we've covered a little bit before in terms of Len Blavatnik is a key oligarch, and he's a sort of transnational oligarch. He's British-based, but he's also a U.S. citizen, so he can invest in American elections, but he's also has these strong Russian ties. And of course, as we've identified before, he tied in directly now with the current Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Mnuchin.
Yes.
And so clearly the people on the left who understand that Mnuchin is a predatory capitalist who was key in the 2008 crisis and being a vulture capitalist, there are important linkages here. And so this is all here, including Victor Vekselberg, which is very much tied in to very close to the Russian government and Putin circles. So, Greg, any sort of finishing comments?
Yeah, and also the other interesting fact about we've identified about Blavatnik is that he, along with Lev Leviev, another big-time quote-unquote Russian oligarch / mob criminal figure, is that they are among the two biggest financial supporters of Chabad globally. So that's another, I think, important point to point out there about Mr. Blavatnik in this whole in this entire narrative here, and all this going on here. But my last point, I guess I would sum this up by saying that I think that the term that has come to be associated in a lot of circles with Russiagate is quote-unquote nothing burger. And where did this originate from? This originated from a video of James O'Keefe of Project Veritas, which I think has been a key right-wing operation as far as quote-unquote exposing the crimes of the left and the corruption of the left, so to speak. I think a lot of largely manufactured type of controversies and all this go over the years with Mr. O'Keefe. And this is him getting Van Jones of CNN on record to say that it's a big nothing burger. I find this interesting because the left, you'll find a lot of these people on the left who are very big into this, there's nothing to this Russiagate narrative. They are very critical of James O'Keefe and Project Veritas, calling him a racist and things of that nature. And a lot of times not without validity because of some of the
Greg, we're in our last 20 seconds here.
Okay, all right. Anyway, I'll just sum it up. Are we allowing Van Jones of CNN, and CNN is run by Trump's former buddy Jeff Zucker, and Project Veritas, the Council for National Policy, to create these narratives? Then I mean, what exactly? What what has this accomplished? I think people should look much deeper than these narratives that are being created by these arms of the same establishment that they hate so much.
Great points, Greg. Thank you so much for bringing that up. Chabad, the connection to the CMP, and of course the connections to Unit 9900, ruling the narratives of the so-called left. Until next week, Antidote, we out.